The year is 1220. The place is everywhere and nowhere, the endless steppe that stretches from the edges of China to the doorstep of Europe. This is a Mongol country, a world without borders, without cities in the way you might imagine them, just grass, wind, and horizon. And in that emptiness, something extraordinary is happening. An empire is being born, not from fortresses or farmland, but from movement itself. The Mongols are a people of motion. They grow up on horseback. They eat on horseback. They sleep, they fight, they live in the saddle. To them, the horse is not a tool, it's an extension of the body. And this changes everything. Because when you can move faster than your enemy can think, when you can appear where you're not expected, vanish before reinforcements arrive, and strike again 100 miles away by dawn, you don't need to be the largest army. You need to be the most unpredictable, the most impossible to pin down. And that's where the Ghost Army begins. Not as a single trick, but as a philosophy, a way of making the steppe itself a weapon. Genghis Khan understood something that most rulers of his time did not. War is not just fought with swords. It's fought with perception. With the stories enemies tell themselves in the dark. With the reports that travel faster than soldiers ever could. And on the steppe, where distance swallows detail and dust obscures truth, perception was everything. A small force could become a nightmare. 100 riders could become a legend. All you needed was the right wind, the right light, and the knowledge of exactly what a frightened scout would see and what he would believe he saw. This wasn't deception for its own sake. It was a strategy, elegant, efficient, and devastatingly effective. And it started with one simple question. What does an army look like from far away? The answer would change the world. Let's go back to that scout, the one watching from the hillside. What exactly is he seeing? Not men, not yet. From 2 miles away, maybe 3, individual riders blur into motion. Shapes, dust, the glint of metal catching the last light of day. He's seeing signals of an army, and his brain is filling in the rest. This is where the Mongols were brilliant. They understood that the human mind, when afraid, counts generously. It sees 100 and imagines 1,000. It sees dust and imagines legions, and they used that. Here's how it worked. First, the dummy riders. Each Mongol warrior would tie straw-stuffed dummies to the spare horses they brought with them. And Mongol soldiers always traveled with multiple horses, often 3 or 4 per man. These weren't crude scarecrows. They were weighted carefully, positioned to sit upright in the saddle, dressed in spare armor or leather. From a distance, they moved with the rhythm of the herd. They looked real. And when a tumen, a unit of 10,000, was actually only 2,000 or 3,000 men, those extra horses and their silent riders made the numbers swell. But it wasn't just the dummies. It was the dust. The Mongols would tie branches to the tails of their horses, brush, shrubs, anything that would drag behind and kick up dirt. A single rider became a cloud. 100 riders became a rolling storm on the horizon. The dust didn't just obscure numbers. It suggested movement, chaos, mass. Enemy scouts, watching from distant towers or hillsides, couldn't count individuals. They could only see the size of the disturbance, and they reported what they feared. We know this from the chronicles. Persian historians, writing during the Mongol invasions, described armies so vast the earth trembled beneath them. Chinese records speak of forces numberless as the stars. But archaeological evidence, grave sites, military camps, logistical records tells a different story. The actual Mongol armies were often smaller than their enemies believed, sometimes significantly smaller. At the Battle of Mohi in 1241, European sources claimed the Mongols had brought 100,000 warriors to Hungary. Modern historians estimate the real number was closer to 20,000. Yet the Hungarians, convinced they were vastly outnumbered, broke formation. They fled, and they were destroyed, not by the army they faced, but by the army they believed they faced. The Ghost Army wasn't just a trick. It was a psychological weapon. And it worked because the Mongols understood one fundamental truth. On the open steppe, where vision stretches for miles, and the air is dry and the dust is fine, reality is negotiable. What you see depends on the light, the distance, the wind, and the Mongols controlled all of it. They moved at dusk, they moved at dawn. They moved when the sun was low and shadows were long, and every rider cast the silhouette of three. They became a mirage, a rumor made flesh. And by the time their enemies realized the truth, it was always too late. Now, let's pull back the curtain completely. Let's look at the mechanics, the anatomy of illusion. Because what the Mongols did wasn't random. It was a system, refined over generations, passed down from father to son, tested in 100 battles across 1,000 miles. And it had layers. The first layer, multiplication. We've talked about the dummy riders, but consider the mathematics of it. A standard Mongol tumen, 10,000 men, would travel with 30 to 40,000 horses. That's 3 to 4 horses per warrior. Some for riding in shifts, some for carrying supplies, some held in reserve for battle. Now imagine that half of those spare horses carry dummies. Suddenly, your 10,000 men project the visual signature of 25,000. But you're not trying to fool someone up close. You're trying to fool someone 2 miles away, 3 miles, 5. From that distance, dust matters more than detail. And so we come to the second layer, the dust clouds. Mongol warriors would ride in dispersed formations, not tight ranks like European knights, spread out, wide, covering ground, each horse dragging brush, each set of hooves throwing up dry earth. The cumulative effect was a horizon-wide disturbance, a visual wall of movement. Scouts couldn't count riders through that. They could only estimate based on the size of the cloud, and the Mongols made sure that cloud was massive. Contemporary accounts describe Mongol approach as heralded by a darkening of the air itself. Not metaphorically, literally. The dust was so thick it blocked the sun. Third layer, the campfires. At night, the illusion continued. Each Mongol warrior was trained to light not one fire, but 5, spread out across the camp. Small fires, controlled but numerous. From a distant ridge, enemy scouts would count the fires and multiply. 1 fire per 10 men, they'd think. 1,000 fires meant 10,000 soldiers. But in reality, those 1,000 fires were lit by 2,000 men, maybe fewer. The Mongols understood that enemies don't just scout during the day, they scout at night, and at night fire is the only language. So they spoke it fluently. They spoke it in numbers that didn't exist. Fourth layer, acoustic warfare. This one is less documented but equally fascinating. The Mongols carried drums, large ones, and when they wanted to announce their presence, or more accurately, to announce a presence, they would beat them in coordinated waves. The sound would carry for miles across the flat steppe. Deep, rhythmic, multiplied by distance and echo into something that sounded like the heartbeat of an unstoppable force. Combine that with the war cries of thousands of throats, each man trained to shout not once, but in bursts, in intervals, creating the auditory impression of far greater numbers, and you have an army that sounds twice its size. Fifth layer, the scouts themselves. The Mongols didn't just create illusions, they curated them. They knew enemy scouts would be watching, So they made sure those scouts saw exactly what they wanted them to see. Mongol reconnaissance units would deliberately let enemy scouts escape, let them ride back with their reports of impossible numbers, of an unstoppable tide. Because a scout who escapes carries a story, and that story spreads faster than any army could march. It reaches the enemy capital before the Mongols do. It demoralizes. It fractures alliances. It makes cities surrender before the first arrow is fired. This is the deep genius of the Ghost Army. It wasn't just about looking bigger. It was about being believed to be bigger. And belief in war is half the battle. The Mongols didn't just fight with swords and bows. They fought with information, with controlled leaks, with strategic theater. They understood that an enemy who believes he's outnumbered will make mistakes. He'll retreat when he should stand. He'll divide his forces when he should concentrate. He'll exhaust his resources preparing for an invasion that arrives differently than expected. And by the time the real Mongol force appears, smaller, faster, more surgical than the nightmare the enemy prepared for, it's already too late. The psychological damage is done. The Ghost Army has already won. Not with steel, but with shadow. With the careful manipulation of distance, dust, fire, sound, and fear. It's one of history's most elegant deceptions, a trick that required no lies. Only an understanding of how humans see, how we count, how we fear, and how, on the open steppe, under the right conditions, reality itself becomes negotiable. Now, let's watch it work. Let's see what happens when the Ghost Army meets real walls, real soldiers, real decisions made by real commanders who believe they're staring at the end of the world. The year is 1219. The place is Otrar, a wealthy trading city on the Silk Road in what is now Kazakhstan. The governor, a man named Inalchuk, has made a fatal mistake. He's executed Mongol merchants, seized their goods, insulted Genghis Khan's emissaries, and now the response is coming. But here's the thing. Otrar is fortified, high walls, deep wells, granaries stocked for a siege, a garrison of thousands. Inalchuk believes he can hold. He's heard the stories, of course. Everyone has. Stories of Mongol hordes stretching to the horizon. But he's also heard their exaggerated, nomad gossip, steppe legends. So when his scouts return with reports of an approaching army, tens of thousands, they say, maybe more, Inalchuk hesitates. He looks at his walls, his men, his supplies, and he makes a calculation. He decides to wait, to let the Mongols come, to let them break themselves against stone. This is the moment the Ghost Army is designed for. The Mongol force approaching Otrar is not the massive horde the scouts described. It's a smaller vanguard, perhaps 5,000 men. But they arrive at dusk. Spread wide, dust rising, drums beating in the distance, fires lighting across the plain like a constellation. From the walls, the defenders see exactly what they feared, an ocean of warriors. Infinite, unstoppable. Inalchuk's confidence wavers. His men whisper. Some want to flee, others want to send help. But the nearest reinforcements are weeks away, and the Mongols don't wait. They encircle the city, not tightly, loosely, suggestively, leaving gaps, leaving routes of escape. This is another layer of the psychological trick. The Mongols learned early that a cornered enemy fights desperately, but an enemy who believes he has an escape route. He hesitates, he negotiates with himself. He waits for the right moment to run, and in that waiting, he loses cohesion. Over the next weeks, the siege tightens, not through overwhelming force, but through patience, through the constant presence of threat, through nighttime raids that suggest endless reserves, through the rotation of banners and units that make it seem like fresh reinforcements are arriving daily. In reality, it's the same 5,000 men, rotating positions, changing armor, flying different flags. But to the defenders it looks like the army is growing, like the world itself is turning Mongol. And then the messages start arriving. Other cities have fallen: Bukhara, Samarkand, each one supposedly overwhelmed by forces too numerous to count. These messages are accurate, but what they don't say is how those cities fell. Not through brute force, through surrender, through the same psychological erosion now eating away at Otrar's walls. Inside the city, fractures appear. Some officers want to fight, others want to negotiate. Still others begin slipping away through those carefully left gaps in the Mongol lines. Exactly as planned, because every deserter carries the story back to other cities. The story of the unstoppable horde, the ghost army made flesh. When Otrar finally falls, after 5 months, it's not because the Mongols overwhelmed it. It's because the defenders overwhelmed themselves, exhausted by fear, by the mathematics of impossibility, by the belief that they were facing something no wall could stop. The historical record is clear on this. The Persian historian Juvaini, writing decades later, describes the Mongol conquest not as a military campaign, but as a kind of inevitability, a force of nature. But what he's really describing is the success of the ghost army, the way perception became reality, the way a smaller force, through carefully orchestrated illusion, convinced an entire region that resistance was futile. We see it again in Russia, in 1223 at the Battle of the Kalka River. Russian princes, hearing reports of a massive Mongol army approaching, gather their forces, 30,000 men, maybe more. They march out to meet the threat. But when they encounter the Mongols, something strange happens. The Mongol force appears to retreat. The Russians pursue. They chase for days, and with each day they see more dust, more fires, more evidence of a vast army just beyond reach. What they don't realize is that they're being led, stretched thin, exhausted. And when the Mongols finally turn to fight, the Russian army is scattered, disorganized, mentally defeated before the first arrow flies. The actual Mongol force was perhaps 20,000, smaller than the Russian army. But the Russians believed they were facing twice that, 3 times that. And belief shaped the battle. This is the turning point. The moment we realize that the ghost army isn't just a trick for scouts. It's a weapon that works on everyone, on commanders, on soldiers, on entire kingdoms. Because once the story takes root, once the legend of the numberless horde spreads, it becomes self-fulfilling. Cities surrender without siege. Armies retreat without battle. And the Mongols, moving fast and light, become exactly what their enemies fear. Everywhere. Inevitable. Undefeatable. Not because they are, but because everyone believes they are. And on the steppe, in the 13th century, belief was the only truth that mattered. So, what are we really looking at here? What is the ghost army at its core? Strip away the dust and the dummies and the drums, strip away the tactical brilliance, and what you're left with is something deeper, something almost uncomfortable to acknowledge. The Mongols understood that reality is not fixed, that what we see is not always what is, that the space between perception and truth is where power lives. This wasn't unique to them, of course. Every military commander in history has used deception. The Trojan horse, the empty fort strategy of ancient China, Patton's Phantom Army in World War II, inflatable tanks and fake radio chatter designed to convince the Germans that the D-Day invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. But the Mongols did something different. They didn't just deceive in moments. They built deception into their entire system of war. It wasn't a trick, it was a philosophy. A way of understanding that the battlefield exists in 2 places, on the ground and in the mind. And the battle in the mind is often decided before the battle on the ground ever begins. Think about what that means. The Mongols were nomads. They had no castles. No stone cities, no industrial base. They couldn't outlast their enemies in a siege. They couldn't outproduce them in weapons or armor. So they had to outthink them. They had to win the war of information, the war of narrative. They had to make their enemies defeat themselves. And they did. Again and again, from Korea to Hungary, from the steppes of Asia to the forests of Europe. The ghost army rode ahead of them like a prophecy, like a nightmare made of wind and rumor. But here's what's fascinating. The Mongols didn't invent most of these techniques. Dummy riders were used by earlier steppe peoples. Dust clouds were a natural byproduct of cavalry movement. Multiple campfires, acoustic warfare, these were known tactics. What the Mongols did was systematize them, refine them, turn them into doctrine. They took the individual tricks and wove them into something greater, a comprehensive strategy of psychological dominance, and they taught it. Every Mongol warrior, from childhood, learned not just how to ride and shoot, but how to appear, how to make themselves look like more, how to move in ways that maximized visual impact, how to understand what an enemy scout would see from 3 miles away. This was military education at a level most armies wouldn't reach for centuries. It required discipline, coordination, a shared understanding of the goal, and it worked because the Mongols trusted it. They believed in the power of the ghost army as much as their enemies did, maybe more. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal but telling nonetheless, about a Mongol commander during the invasion of Persia. His force was outnumbered 10-1. His officers urged retreat. But the commander looked at the terrain, at the time of day, at the position of the sun, and he smiled. "They don't know how many we are," he said, "so let's tell them a story." He deployed his men in the widest possible formation, lit twice the normal number of fires, sent riders back and forth across the horizon all night, trailing dust. By morning, the Persian army had withdrawn, not because they were defeated, because they were convinced they were about to be. This is the deeper insight. The ghost army reveals something fundamental about human nature, about how we process threats, about how our minds, when confronted with uncertainty, tend to err on the side of caution. We overestimate danger. We see patterns that aren't there. We count shadows as soldiers. The Mongols didn't create this tendency. They simply understood it, and they used it. Not with cruelty, necessarily, but with precision. With the same efficiency they applied to everything else. Movement, communication, conquest. In a strange way, the ghost army was merciful. Think about it. How many cities surrendered without a fight because they believed resistance was hopeless? How many lives were saved because the battle was won before it started? The Mongols were brutal when they needed to be. History records that clearly. But they were also pragmatic. They preferred submission to slaughter, not out of kindness, but out of efficiency. And the ghost army made submission easier. It gave cities a reason to surrender that didn't feel like cowardice. You weren't surrendering to a few thousand horsemen. You were surrendering to the inevitable, to a force that couldn't be stopped. There's a kind of dark poetry in that, a recognition that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't steel. It's a story, the story we tell ourselves about what's possible, about what's coming, about what we can survive. And the Mongols, moving across the steppe with their dust clouds and their drums and their carefully calculated illusions, they were master storytellers.
They wrote the narrative, and the world read it and believed. The Mongol Empire didn't last forever. No empire does. By the late 13th century, it had fractured into khanates. By the 14th, those khanates were fighting each other. By the 15th, the descendants of Genghis Khan ruled smaller kingdoms, not the world. And the ghost army? It faded with them. Not because the tactics stopped working, but because the world changed. Gunpowder arrived, fortifications improved, armies became more professional, more centralized, and the vast open spaces where dust clouds and dummy riders could deceive, those spaces grew smaller. Roads were built, maps were drawn. The fog of distance began to lift, but the lesson remained, written into the chronicles, whispered in the military academies of later empires. The idea that perception shapes reality, that fear is a weapon, that an army's greatest strength might not be its size, but the story told about its size. You can see echoes of it throughout history. In Napoleon's rapid movements, designed to make his enemies think he was in two places at once. In the Allies' deception campaigns during World War II. In modern information warfare, where the battle for narrative happens online, in real time, with the same goal the Mongols had 8 centuries ago. Make your enemy believe something that helps you win. The Ghost Army never really disappeared. It just changed form. But there's something about the original, the Mongol version, that feels almost pure, elegant in its simplicity, born from necessity, from a people who had nothing but horses and sky and an understanding of how light bends at dusk. They looked at the steppe and saw a canvas. They looked at distance and saw opportunity. They looked at human fear and saw a tool. And with those materials, they built an empire, not just of land, but of belief. Today, the steppes are quiet. The dust settles quickly now. The wind carries no drums, no distant thunder of hooves. But if you stand in the right place, at the right time of day, when the sun is low and the shadows are long, you can almost see them. The ghost riders, moving on the horizon, endless, impossible, more legend than memory. And maybe that's fitting, because the Ghost Army was never really about what was there. It was about what people believed was there. And in that way, it still exists. In the space between what we see and what we think we see. In the stories we tell ourselves about threat and power and the unstoppable force just beyond the hill. The Mongols knew something we're still learning. That reality, at a distance, is whatever we say it is. That an army of 100 can become 10,000. That dust can become destiny. And that sometimes, the most powerful weapon in the world is a shadow. And so the Ghost Army rides into history, a whisper of hoofbeats, a memory of dust, a reminder that the line between truth and illusion has always been thinner than we think. The Mongols understood this. They built an empire on it, not with lies, but with careful orchestration of what could be seen, what could be heard, what could be believed. And in doing so, they changed the world, not just through conquest, but through the idea of conquest, through the story that traveled faster than any arrow, the story that made kings tremble and cities open their gates, the story of an army that was everywhere and nowhere, real and unreal, 100 men who became 10,000 in the eyes of those who feared them. Tonight, as you close your eyes, perhaps you'll see them too, moving across some interior step of your own imagination. Dust rising, drums in the distance, the Ghost Army still riding after all these centuries, still teaching us that power is not always what it seems, that perception can be as sharp as any blade, and that sometimes the most effective way to win is to make your enemy believe the battle is already over. If this story has stirred something in you, if you find yourself thinking about dust clouds and dummy riders and the way history bends around a single clever idea, then return again. There are other whispers waiting, other forgotten moments when the world turned on a strategy, a deception, a truth hidden in plain sight. The steppe is vast, and the stories it holds, they're still out there, waiting to be heard.